Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today's guest is Mats Larsson, founder of the Global Energy Transformation Institute and a true systems thinker who has spent over 2 decades sounding the alarm and proposing the solutions for how to electrify the world in a way that actually works. Mats has written extensively on what it'll take to move from fossil fuel-based infrastructure to a fully sustainable society. He's one of the few voices arguing that this change cannot be piecemeal. It requires orchestration, coordination, and leadership on the scale of the Apollo program. In this episode, we explore the deep technical, economic, and political terrain of energy transformation, what it will take, who needs to lead, and what happens if we fail. And with that, Mats, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Wes.
Yeah.
I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to have you and excited to get into it. So with that, we'll start at the beginning. Take us back to the early 2000s. What sparked your conviction that electromobility would require nothing less than a systemic overhaul?
Well, I realized at an early stage around 2005 that we can't continue to rely on petroleum fuels for very long into the future, and we need to prepare the change. And at that time, I realized, wow, if we want to move to another type of fuel, to another type of transportation system, we need to really build the systems that we will need in order to run transportation in a different way. And these systems consist of many different subsystems like fuel production, fuel distribution, vehicle production, vehicle development, vehicle distribution, and so on. So we need to take care of all of those in order to change to a new transportation system. And we can't just focus on the vehicles, the charging solutions. We need to take a broad view on all the aspects and manage the entire change across all subsystems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've loved just the way you think about that holistically and kind of just viewing the entire picture, how it all connects. And I think that's what's missed a lot of times. So, and I mentioned you spent over 2 decades pushing for electrification at scale. What belief or insight has remained constant for you throughout that time? And maybe what's shifted most dramatically?
Well, what's remained constant is this systems perspective and the realization that, for example, the Apollo program wouldn't have been successful if NASA had not managed all the aspects of the change. And they had built a space center, a launch ramp, a crawler, the vehicle that took the rocket from the vehicle assembly building up to the launch ramp, etc. So without all these activities, the Apollo program would not have succeeded. And when we look at transportation systems, there are thousands of different companies that need to be involved in different parts of the change. And they need to, now that we know that we are changing to electricity, there are utilities, and there are hundreds of them in many countries. There are technology providers that provide technologies for power generation, for power distribution, for charging infrastructure. There are operators of charging infrastructure. There are automotive companies.
Yeah.
And there are a host of other types of players that need to be involved. Not only private companies, but also public organizations like municipalities, regional authorities, state governments in the US, and the federal government in the US that need to take different roles. And in order to do this, there is a need for coordination and
Right.
for management of the change, because it's not only a matter of getting all these to understand what they are doing. They need to act and make investments and conduct activities in a way that makes sense from the overall change perspective. And so that has remained constant in my vision of the change.
Sure.
What has probably changed the most in my view is the perspective of the fuels that may be possible. And at an early stage, I realized that electricity would be the only fuel or type of energy that could be produced on a large enough scale to fuel all vehicles on the planet.
Sure.
Biofuels, there's simply not enough raw material to produce enough grain-based or cellulose-based biofuels to make it possible to run all transportation on any of those. So electricity is the only one. And I realized that at an early stage, but I have become even more convinced of this as we have made progress. And I have also realized that hydrogen, which is often seen as an alternative to electricity or even a way to charge using electricity, because hydrogen is produced using large amounts of electricity. Hydrogen could not be used on a large scale, as far as I understand, because so much so that there is such a need for large amounts of power to produce hydrogen that we could not realistically build the power generation necessary to produce hydrogen to fuel all transportation. I wouldn't say that this has changed dramatically for me as a person, but it has changed dramatically in terms of the view of the automotive industry and sustainability advocates and other people who are interested in the change. Because when I started out to analyze the change, most people believed that the biofuels would be the future.
Yeah.
And even Volvo, Volvo Trucks, that was at that point the leader outside of China in the heavy trucks industry. They developed 7 different engines for trucks based on biofuels. There
Yeah.
was not at that time in 2009. None of these engines were electric in any way. So they developed 7 different engines that could use biogas or ethanol, methanol, and different combinations of biofuels. And they didn't at that point realize that electricity could be used to run trucks as well. But that has changed a lot since then, and that has changed for me as well, because I believed at that time that, for heavy transportation, we will have to stick to either petroleum fuels or perhaps to some type of biofuel.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, a lot of great perspective in there, and I would agree with it. I would say I'm not a chemical engineer. I did talk to one yesterday that agreed with you on the hydrogen point, but I do think we're seeing some like very specific use cases and applications where those absolutely do make sense. But when you're talking about at scale, just electrifying just all vehicles, fueling all vehicles, I agree wholeheartedly with all of what you shared there. I'll come back to it. I really want to dig in a little bit to the Apollo program parallel. I love that parallel, but I want to focus a little bit just quickly on the Global Energy Transformation Institute, just kind of what went into it, how it was founded, and then how you would describe the core mission of it to someone hearing about it for the first time.
Well, the core mission is to develop the ideas around orchestrated change or managed change of the transportation systems for cars, heavy vehicles, for goods, and for people in buses and so on. There are so many different aspects that need to be taken into account when we are planning the future for those aspects that have not so far been widely recognized by most experts and
Yeah.
by decision makers who think that we could simply ban the sales of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2035 or by some date in the future, and then the market forces will take care of the rest. So the mission that I'm trying to accomplish is to inform people of the need for management and for support in various ways for this change, and in order and also to run projects where we make these needs apparent.
Absolutely. So I do want to go back to the parallels between the Apollo program and the Marshall Plan, and you're often drawing those parallels, but I think is really fascinating. And when you said it immediately, I was like, oh gosh, that makes so much sense. I hadn't had anybody make those parallels before. But talk to us a little bit more about that. Like, what specific lessons do you think we need to take from those efforts today, and digging into that more in terms of the parallel and why you've made those claims?
Yes, basically, a lot of development has been run and has been achieved over the past decades without any managed change programs. But there has been a lot of public investments, in particular in many of the most important technologies we use today. The US government has invested heavily in the early stages of development, like computers, where the US government financed a lot of the development from the end of the Second World War until 1970s, 1980s, and the internet, where the ARPANET was the basis for the internet, and the technologies developed to run the ARPANET were then applied on a larger scale to make the foundation for the internet, and so on. And there are many other examples where government financing has been necessary. But in these cases, like computers, there's never been a deadline. No one has ever said that by this particular year we will change to this type of computer or run the world on this particular technology.
Yeah.
But in this case, with the change, there is like John F. Kennedy realized in 1961, and he challenged the nation to send a man to the moon and bring him safely back to Earth. And he set the date that this must be accomplished by the end of the decade, and that created a need for management, because to do all this in 9 years required a lot of planning, a lot of management, and NASA had to take the overall responsibility to make sure that all the activities, all the development steps were undertaken that were needed to accomplish all the different developments of materials, technology, solutions, miniaturizations, the vehicles involved, the spacecraft involved, and so on. So in order to do that in only 8 or 9 years, required this huge amount of management and coordination of the activities. And we're in a similar situation now, when governments across the world, the EU, national governments in Europe, air regulators in California, they are saying we need to ban the sales of new gasoline and diesel vehicles, from gasoline and diesel cars, from 2035. Oh, if we want to accomplish that, we need to develop the power infrastructure to a certain point, because we would need much more power in order to fuel all vehicles using electricity instead of petroleum. And we need a lot of charging solutions, and we can't just select any charging solutions that happen to be the best ones for the short term. We need to think ahead and say, what charging solutions do we need when the majority of cars are electric? Can we really charge all cars while on road trips across the US or across Europe? Can we really charge all cars in the summer, during the summer driving season, standing still in stationary charging infrastructure? Or do we need other solutions? And we need to think of that now, because if we need other solutions, like battery switch solutions or electric roads, we need to start to build those now, because it will take not 1, but probably 2 or 3 decades until we have fully fledged systems involving these types of solutions. We need to develop technologies and system solutions and business models to go with them. So there is really a big need for both analysis and to see what solutions will we need when the majority of vehicles are electric. how can we implement those, and how can we expand the access to new forms of charging, for example, so that we have them available once the majority of people have electric cars and electric trucks.
Yeah, it's such a great perspective. And again, that parallel to me paints such a good picture. And to me, it's very, very accurate to where we are. And I think with that, we get a sense of kind of vision and where you've come from. But I want to move a little bit into practical realities, just what it'll take to actually execute a transformation on the scale and where we are at most risk of falling short. So in your opinion, like, what are the most underestimated technical and organizational challenges in the transition to electric vehicles today?
I think the most underestimated challenges are the financial challenges and the scale of the implementation of the different technologies. Because in the US right now, and also overall in Europe, we have 3% electric cars. In some parts, like California, there are more. In Sweden, Norway, far ahead of the rest of Europe. But overall, we have 3% electric cars. We have less than 1% electric trucks. So that this change to electric trucks, at least heavy trucks, is at a very early stage. So no country, I'd say perhaps not even Norway, that are the leaders in this transformation. No country has experienced a situation where the majority of vehicles are electric. And we haven't experienced a situation where there is really a big demand for electricity to fuel all cars. Because in Europe, about half of our electric cars are hybrids with relatively small batteries. So we have even perhaps less than 1.5% fully electric cars at present, and about 1.5% hybrids that are run on petroleum most of the time. So it's and then for example, Elon Musk has calculated, and he said in an interview at the conference CodeCon 2021 that in order to charge all vehicles in the US, drive them on electricity, you'd need to double power generation. And that means 4,000 new terawatt hours of power needed in order to fuel all cars, probably also to produce batteries and so on. And for Europe, we need about half of the current power generation in order to run all our vehicles on electricity. So that's a huge amount. There is no way to get around it. You can't just say probably we'll need, electric vehicles become more efficient in the future and they'll need less electricity, because electric motors are already 93, 94, 95% efficient. So it's not likely to, the amount of electricity needed is not likely to decrease. We can perhaps build more powerful batteries. We can build smaller batteries, being able to hold more electricity per weight unit and so on. But we will need this amount of electricity in the future in order to fuel all vehicles using electricity. And that is a really important realization. So we'll need huge amounts of financing, and there will have to be very big activities in terms of reinforcement of power grids, expansion of power generation, expansion of charging infrastructure. So I don't think most people or most decision makers have realized the amount of money that will need to be invested in order to build these systems and to reinforce and expand different parts of these infrastructures. And I think that will be the biggest challenge, to actually get people to accept that this will be necessary, to get investors to put in the money, and to start enough projects and start enough investment programs to make this possible, because it will be much more, it will require more financing than even the Apollo program, I think.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, really interesting insights there. It really just makes you stop and think and give you great perspective. And you've shared this a couple times, but you've said without the coordinated transformation programs, the electrification effort risks stalling. You've already shared a few things, but any other sort of like, can you explain what those programs would need to look like? You know, if we were set up for success, what would that need to look like?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
It is.
Because I don't think so many people have really considered what they would need to look like. I've done some thinking, and I think, well, there will have to be structured change, managed change on different levels. So governments need to take a leading role because they need to determine how much different types of systems will need to expand. They need to communicate this to the different players, and there is no need to make these types of overall calculations in many places. They could
Yeah.
be made in Washington or in Brussels, or at least in each of the European capitals by governments or government agencies. But then doing this and managing this change, different authorities need to be involved on the state level, regional level, and at the municipal level. And municipalities, for example, need to take some responsibility in planning and identifying areas in cities and towns where charging infrastructure could be built. They need to communicate with utilities to make sure that we get enough electricity to this, and discuss how much would power generation need to be expanded. Perhaps not on the municipal level for power generation. That could be on the state level, or some middle level. But power grid capacity locally, etc. That needs to be coordinated, and we also need to make sure that different companies that will invest in charging infrastructure know about the amount of charges that will need to be built and so on. And that seems to be a really tough challenge to solve, how to actually make all these investments happen in such a short period of time, considering the number of different organizations, companies, um, individuals, I mean, families that need to buy vehicles and cars, and companies that need to buy vehicles, and companies that need to invest in charging infrastructure and so on. Well, coordinating and making sure that all of these parties with different agendas, different financial situations, etc., are actually prepared to do their part, or estimating how many will be. So, in case we find that only half the households can afford an electric car, and there will not be enough used cars rapidly enough for people with lower incomes to be able to buy those, how can we then facilitate the change and make it possible to move forward? If not all utilities are able to make the investments in the reinforcement of power grids, how can we support them to make this happen, and what types of support will they need, etc.?
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. And another piece of this that we've touched on is you've done extensive work on the logistics side of electrification. And specifically, I want to know what did you learn from your analysis of the Swedish logistics hub that surprised even you?
Yes, we did an analysis last fall of Swedish logistics hub here in southern Sweden. We're only 10 million people here, so it's we need much less goods here than compared to what you need in the US,
Yeah,
and the country from north to south. So a lot of the goods that's transported by truck comes in at the southern part, and so 80% of our fruit and vegetables that's imported to Sweden is imported via a town called Helsingborg,
hmm,
and a particular logistics area there where these are transported into um, logistics centers, and they are reloaded to be distributed further up north into Sweden. There are at this center, even though we're only uh, 10 million people, there are 1,400 trucks every day coming into this logistics hub, and that are at present diesel trucks. All of
yeah,
them are heavy trucks. So, and we have 20 that's 24-meter trucks. That's about 70 feet trucks here in Sweden. So as opposed to in the rest of the EU, where they have 18-meter trucks amounting to about 53, 54 feet, I think. So we have larger trucks, but still we have there are 1,400 trucks visiting this area, and only one of those trucks at present, or at the time we did this analysis, were electric.
Yeah, just one.
So, but over the coming years, the EU has decided to rapidly phase out diesel trucks. And automotive companies need to sell more electric trucks, and logistics companies and transportation companies need to buy them, of course, and they need to implement them. According to the plans, a lot more electric trucks will be used over the coming decade. By 2035, 2040, a large share of all trucks used will be electric. So of those 1,400 trucks, maybe in 2035, half of them may be electric or more.
Sure.
And what we found was that if we want to continue to run transportation systems in the same way as we're doing today, with short stops and a high rate of utilization of vehicles, that will require very large, very high capacity for charging at each point for each truck. And trucks that are charged at high capacity, they need much more capacity than most other uses of electricity. One truck that's charged at 300 kilowatts require twice as much capacity as 100 dishwashers or 100 heat pumps. So that's a huge amount. And the transportation industry, they are thinking in terms of charging at 1 megawatt, which is 3 times the capacity of the 350 kilowatts that I mentioned. So 1 megawatt is a huge amount. Actually, top load, the peak load of electricity on this logistics area was 11.9 megawatts. So 12 trucks charged at the 1 megawatt would require as much capacity as the entire logistics area with 19 logistics centers and 1,400 trucks visiting every day require at present. So that's an almost unimaginable amount of electricity that's needed only to charge a small number of trucks, in case we would like to charge them very rapidly, so that, we could get, say, 200 miles of range in half an hour of charging. So in order to charge to drive 200 miles, you need to charge for half an hour at 1 megawatt. So if we would like to continue to run our transportation systems, the amount of electricity needed would be very, very high. And there's simply not that amount of electricity or capacity grid capacity available at present. And it will be difficult to expand ahead of demand because utilities are not allowed to invest unless there is a customer order, some type of, unless a customer has ordered or asked for an expansion of their subscription. Utilities are not allowed to make an investment in reinforcing the grid at that point. They can do to a small extent, but not across the board, like in many places where expansion or reinforcement will be needed. So that was one of the big learnings from this project, that if we want to run transportation systems in the same way as we are doing today, with short stops and high utilization of vehicles, which leads to low costs of transportation for customers, we need to make huge investments in the power grid capacity and power generation in order to supply enough electricity. If we're not prepared to do that, and if it turns out that these investments are too big, to actually be viable. We will need to rethink how we transport things and how transportation systems are designed today, and how vehicles are utilized and so on. So either big changes will be needed in the utilities industry, or big changes will be needed in the transportation industry, depending on the level of investment that will be needed in order to achieve the changes that will be necessary.
Yeah, and thinking about just those investments and some of the innovations that are coming that could accelerate or redefine the road ahead, what are some of maybe the most promising technological innovations on your radar that could accelerate this transformation?
Yes, I think electric roads is a really important and potentially very promising innovation. But large and extensive systems of electric roads with extensive installation of tracks in the road surfaces will be needed so that vehicles can charge while driving. That would make it, if we had those roads across big geographies, we'd be able to charge while driving, and we could reduce the number of hours that will be needed for charging overall. And if we put a cost to the hours that will need to be used for charging in case we have to do stationary charging, we will find that the cost of charging in stationary chargers will be very high. For companies, it's obvious that there is a cost. For truck transportation companies and so on, it's obvious that they have to pay the driver, they have to pay for the vehicle, and they may have to increase the vehicle fleets by a number of extra vehicles, say by 10%, in order to make up for the time that will be used in order to charge in stationary chargers. So, but for private citizens, it's not as apparent.
Yeah.
That there's a cost connected to us charging. If we are driving in the summer over long distances, we'll need to stop to charge maybe every 200 or 300 miles, depending on the capacity of our batteries. That there's a cost to that, and there's a need. There is also a cost to accommodating the size of charging infrastructure to peak demand. If at some point in, say, July, there is a peak demand on a certain motorway where that only happens a couple of times on Fridays when a lot of people hit the road to go somewhere, then we need to build enough chargers to cover the need at that point or at that time along this entire road. So every 50 miles or so, people need to, there will have to be enough chargers for people to be able to charge even at these times when demand peaks. But the alternative could be to install or build electric road systems on a large scale, and then all cars that have the opportunity to charge while driving, we need to install these appliances so we could charge while we drive, and we could just increase the amount of electricity that is fed into the charging tracks in the road at each point to cover the peaks. So there are a lot of advantages, and it could potentially reduce the cost over the long term. But the investment for the short term will probably not seem as if it will be worth it, because at present, when we have few electric cars, few electric trucks, it will not be as apparent that we will need those electric roads. Mm-hmm. But when electric car fleets, electric truck fleets increase and grow, a lot of people will experience that waiting time at chargers, or that they will reconsider, perhaps say, we shouldn't go on vacation this week because there will be so much pressure on charging infrastructure. We could go next week instead. So people may have to adapt their behavior and their planning to the availability of chargers and charging capacity if we will not have electric roads.
Sure. Yeah, really good insights there, and just perspective thinking about the future. It's hard to think that it eventually it won't happen, right? I think, obviously it's such a small percentage now of electric vehicles on the road, but those percentages are ticking up every year, and going up every year, and eventually it will become a necessity, a problem
Mhm.
that we'll have to solve. But nice if we could get ahead of that and think about it.
Yes.
But it's a part of whatever we do. You think about and it's maybe it's a lot simpler,
Yeah.
but cell phones, and you think about, okay, well, now there are chargers literally everywhere, and you go to the airport and you set the thing on your armrest of your chair, and it's charging your phone, and just how
Mm.
that's evolved quickly, and it's hard to think, with EVs, it's going to follow the same sort of evolution, especially as the necessity increases, is what I would think.
Yes, actually, I think at this point, many people who have electric cars have another gasoline car as well, because I have one that I use when I want to drive long distances, or if I want to pull a trailer, I use my gasoline car. But in a future where gasoline cars or diesel cars, as we have in Europe as well, will be banned. We will not have the opportunity to have a second car that's not electric.
Mhm.
So all the situations where I use for convenience a gasoline car instead of my electric car, I will have to use an electric car.
Mhm.
And that will put pressure on both drivers to actually adapt and to set aside time for charging, and that would put a pressure on operators of charging infrastructure and the governments, etc., to make sure that there's enough capacity for charging for the number of vehicles that need to be charged even at peak times. And there are places already where the demand at some points over the year is much higher than
Sure.
the availability of chargers.
Absolutely. With that, I'll transition a little bit just as we come up on time, and close into just looking further into the future and into the consequences of our actions or inaction. And thinking about that. So what happens if we get this wrong, or what does success look like if we get it right? So if we fail to meet our sustainability goals, what scenarios do you foresee playing out in terms of energy security and economic instability?
Well, there is more than one driver of this change. We are primarily become aware of pollution and the CO2 emissions, but there is also the aspect that oil production may come to a situation where we reach a peak, and the oil volumes will go down after that peak. So we may have less oil in the future than we have today, and the decrease of oil production may be steeper than we expect, because already a number of countries, not the US, but other countries like Norway and the UK and many others, have experienced peaks, and they have seen their oil production decline over the past 2-3 decades. And Norway and the UK actually have produced about, well, less than 50% of the amounts that they did at their peaks. So we need to plan for this. The worst case scenario may be that we see oil production go down without having enough resources prepared to change rapidly over to electric vehicles. And we may see that we can't transport the amount of goods that we are used to. People can't go to work using their car in the way they're used to,
Yeah.
because we don't have enough gasoline or diesel in order to run transportation the way we are doing today. And we haven't perhaps invested enough in the expansion of electric transportation systems to make them prepared to take over large amounts of present transportation work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, we've talked about this on the show many times, but now with the increase in demand, with AI, with data centers, with electrification of everything, with reshoring manufacturing and all those kinds of things that come into play, we're going to need more. And it's oil is not enough, and it is a finite resource. It's all of those things as well too. And you think about how important energy is to your life and your livelihood and everything that you do in our economy and security and all those things that play out. It's probably the single most important resource on the planet.
Definitely.
And so this is a problem you have to solve, regardless of whatever political view or what country you're in or what have you. It's collective and coming together. And I love that, again, those analogies of the Apollo program and those sort of things of kind of like, hey, what are we doing? So let's come together, find solutions, all work together. It requires every piece of the puzzle to make it happen. So yeah, I love all of that.
Absolutely. You mentioned data centers, and there's at present a surge in demand for the capacity of data centers, and there's for AI, and there's a surge in demand for electricity to power those data centers. So there's already an increasing demand for electricity, but not coming from the transportation area. And this, even though this data center demand will only increase electricity demand by 1% compared to today. The suppliers of equipment for power generation, for power grids, etc., they are experiencing a boom in demand, and they're expanding like mad. At present, these producers, they double their production only due to the increasing demand from data centers. And to fuel electric cars by electricity, we would need 50 times the electricity that we now expect to be needed for the data centers for powering AI. So 50 times that, and even with the increase for AI, the power industry or the power equipment industry is experiencing this boom, and they are expanding in any way they can in order to meet demand. So what we're looking at in the near future is a real type of boom in demand for electricity and for electricity equipment and so on, that we probably have never seen in any industry or in any type of environment before. And despite this big need that we can see on the horizon, and that's created by government decisions to a large extent, there is no planning for this. There is no initiation of or starting up of training programs for electricians or power project managers for power generation or power distribution projects, or for what I often call electrification strategists or electrification architects that will be needed for the expansion of the infrastructure for power distribution and for charging and so on. So there will be a big need for competence and for competent individuals in these areas. But there is so far not very much planning to actually satisfy those needs.
Yeah, I agree completely, and thankful for your work that you're doing, books that you're coming out with, and your work just in your organization as well too, and helping to spread that education. And part of why we do this podcast as well too is just getting as much out there as we can, making people aware. So final question, imagine it's the year 2045, so we're going 20 years in the future. What would success look like to you then? And what do you hope your legacy will be in that future?
Well, success would be if we at that point can say that we've managed this change and that we have well-balanced systems for charging and for power generation, power distribution that have supported the change throughout these 20 years in the way that we could mention the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was closed down a year ahead of its intended final ending because it was so successful. It had already achieved the goals that were intended when they started the plan. So and that would be a type of success that we cannot expect to experience in this case, I assume, but at least being able to meet the needs in 20 years' time and say that we have run this expansion over the past 2 decades in such a way that we have foreseen the different needs. We have been able to cater to the needs for, the different types of resources, and we have planned for the competence development. We've planned for the expansion of companies and industries that will be needed, and so on. And we could look back on this development and say, we've really done a good job in planning this, like NASA could do when they sent a man to the moon in 1969 and got him safely back.
Yeah, with that great closing, just sentiments and vision there and thinking about the future. So with that, we'll wrap up. And Mats, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights. To our listeners, I hope it gave you both a sense of urgency and looking at the opportunities of the transformation ahead. Mats makes it clear, if we want a sustainable future, we can't treat it as a patch job. It's going to take new roles, new models, new thinking, and above all, a shared sense of mission. If you found this episode valuable, which I'm sure you did, please leave a review, share it with someone in your network, and help us get the word out. Thanks for tuning into Green Giants, and we will see you soon.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, was brought to you by Lee Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit leegroupsearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.